Welcome back to Who Made You the Boss? This week, I am thrilled to sit down with Kimberly Stuart, an accomplished author and storyteller, to dive into the art of writing, rewriting, and finding grace in the face of perfectionism. She is the author of 8 novels and the newly released nonfiction debut, Star for Jesus and Other Jobs I Quit. But please trust me, even if you're not religious, you're going to get a lot out of this conversation. She and New York Times bestselling author Bob Goff have actually coached hundreds of aspiring authors through their executive coaching, their live events, including myself. I owe Kimberly Stuart a lot. She's been an incredible friend and mentor. Be sure to bookmark her podcast, by the way. She's got For Real with Kimberly Stuart. She's just such a fun and delightful personality. And if you're also a fellow writer, you've got to check out her show with Bob Goff, The Writing Room. Today, she's sharing her highs and lows of the creative journey, from tackling the pressure of book releases to embracing authenticity over external validation. Whether you're a writer or not, if you're simply a dreamer, if you're simply looking for inspiration, this episode is packed with wisdom and humor, which is exactly what I think of when I think of Kim. If you like that kind of stuff, you're also going to love our Who Made You the Boss Substack. So don't forget to go check that out at lindseyepperly.substack.com for more insights and behind the scenes content. All right, listeners, you guys are in for such a treat today because I have invited the wonderful Kimberly Stuart. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Lindsey. It's so good to be here.
It's so good to have you. Listeners, I know Kim because I met her at the Oaks, which is Bob Goff's retreat center. We met 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And then we started doing one-on-one coaching together because, as many of you know, I have been pursuing writing, and Kim and Bob were very much the guides that I chose to lead me into this creative realm. And so I'm really excited to have Kim on the show today because, as you guys know, we're focusing on passion in season 4 of Who Made You the Boss. And I have just been able to follow as Kim pursues her passion. And Kim, there's a lot that I don't know because you pursued this long before you and I met. And I want to delve into that, into kind of how you pursue your why. And then recently, we even saw you get to transform that from writing fiction to writing nonfiction. And so let's dive into your head a little bit, into your story, and talk about your passion. How did this all come about? And do you feel like writing is your why, or is there a greater why? Tell us about it.
Great question. Thank you for having me. I don't know if you want to delve into my brain because you should proceed with caution. I'm middle-aged, Lindsey. And so sometimes things they're just not clicking like they used to be. So I'll do my best. How it all began, I think, is really how it's going now, which is a driving love for good story. And it took me many years to see that as the overarching theme. I was picking individual projects and pursuits, not having that language for it. I used to be an ESL and a Spanish teacher. All my graduate work is in education. I loved that. I was a musician for a very long time, still am quietly. I love to write. I've loved speaking. I'm loving podcasting. I'm loving facilitating those retreats at the Oaks. And I think the thread that I pull every time is a real respect for storytelling, and for watching for what matters within the story. So that goes for both fiction and nonfiction. Probably the battle cry of my whole heart and life has been to be more aware of grace. I'm not a very quick study with that because I'm more of an earner and an achiever. And so the idea of something that's free and beautiful and unfettered that I didn't achieve is very strange for me and very slippery. And so I've written novels that toss that around. I've written a nonfiction book about that. I've ended up speaking in a lot of different ways about that. But the thread is always story. I'm loving having a podcast right now because I love story. I'm so curious about your story. In fact, I'm happy to talk with you, Lindsey, but really I'd like you to tell me your story. I just find that endlessly interesting.
Yeah.
So that I think that's the connecting piece for every part of it.
It is always funny to have fellow podcast hosts on in case you start interviewing me. Sometimes the tables turn and I don't even realize it. There are so many threads I want to pull on from hearing you say all of that. And one of those threads is the fact that you just mentioned that earner mindset
Mm.
and how that shows up in a lot of your work. And I would even call that in my life, it's shown up as a people pleaser. And so I'm curious to kind of camp out on that. Tell me
Mm.
more about the work you've done around it and then how you turn around and help others with it too.
Well, listen, if you need to work on people pleasing or achieving for worth, I don't know if you should go into publishing because most conversations end up with no.
Yeah.
It's just a very strange, as you know, Lindsay, it's just a very strange business. But I don't think it's unique. I think a lot of people feel like that about their work, that there's a certain hamster wheel and that you need to do a lot of jazz hands and cartwheels on that wheel. And eventually someone says, you're the hamster for me. And that can get exhausting, right? Especially when
Yeah.
you're really not in control of a lot of it.
Mhm.
I can see different pivot points in my career. I've been writing for a really long time, but writing for my wage for about 18 years, about 18
Mhm.
years. And I can see very important junctures all along the way of when I had to relearn or even learn for the first time that I needed to have something bigger and greater for which I was working.
Yeah.
And that the mini goal right in front of me could not satisfy and often could not be controlled. So I'll give you an example. I wrote a book once that my agent and I pitched for 18 months with no sale. That's a
Mhm.
long time to pitch a project. This was my sixth published book. Okay. So I felt like surely have I cracked one of the codes at least?
Mhm.
Totally came out of the blue that it took so long. And I would get really lovely feedback and then no. So they'd say, oh, I love this. And no. Oh, this is nice, but no. And so that process was grueling, and I rewrote that dumb thing so many times for 15 different audiences. I just chased whatever carrot was in front of me. Um, and that's a really good example of my why, as you would say, was not big enough.
Mhm.
The longer I got the no, the smaller the why became, right? The
Ooh.
smaller the goal became. Like, I just need someone to tell me this is worthwhile. I need
Mm.
someone with the right pen to bless this effort, right? To give the papal blessing. Yes, this was worth your time. The problem with that way of going through the world is that um, you give far too much power to far too small a thing.
Mm.
So the big thing was, how can I tell a story that matters? I wrote rom-com for a long time, which sounds very frothy. It's actually harder than it looks. And and people want that, right? Most people don't sit around on a Saturday afternoon and think, you know what I really want to watch right now? A disturbing biopic about abuse and heartache and trauma. Most people say, where's Sleepless in Seattle? So we
Yeah.
have a lot of love for that genre in our practice, but not in our speech. And so
Mm.
this book that wasn't selling was me reacting to that and thinking, I need to write literary fiction. I need it to be an Oprah book club pick. And I need the characters to have much more darkness than I typically would have written. It wasn't selling.
Yeah.
And the reason it wasn't selling is because my goal and my why had gotten way too small.
Yeah.
So after 18 months, I ended up hiring an editor who was brutal, just an independent editor who didn't know anything about my other works. This was a completely cold call. She was so mean. This book was just so horrible. I cried for 2 weeks. She did not, at one point in the response, she said, I think you're trying to be funny. Okay. So
Whoa.
for someone who
You
writes
paid this
humor,
woman?
oh, I paid her so well. That's when I came home to Mark, my physics major husband, who's much more linear and stable. And I said, what am I doing? I'm paying this woman to destroy me. I want to be a bank teller. I'm
Yeah.
sick of this job. And Mark, in his wisdom, said, "Let's wait a couple weeks for the dust to settle before you transition to bank telling." Which, by the way, I would fail at miserably. When I finally connected with her for like the call that was included in the project, I mean, I came out guns blazing and just my fists up, my ego so bruised. But I thought I paid for this call. I'm going to take a deep breath and hear what she has to say. And here's the thing. She was entirely right. She was
Mm.
entirely right. Her approach was a little brusque, but the content was completely 100% on. And she said to me, "You are trying to make this book into something that it's not." And I
Mhm.
can read it on every page. This book is a love story. And I'd been kicking against it the whole time, and it had gotten smaller and smaller, that goal. I just want someone to say it's good. I rewrote that book. Page one, started back on page one, started all the way over. And that's the book that ended up my first book in Target stores nationwide. Like, it had a happy ending, but it was a brutal process. And
Yeah.
I wish I could go back to say to that girl, listen, you've made this tiny. You've forgotten why you started. You started for great stories, completely irrespective of how the power movers have, how they feel about it. You know a good story. You know your cadence. You know your readers. Stay with that and beat that drum because it's a beautiful drum and it's worthwhile.
You know, everything I hear you saying from that story too is about our pursuit of external validation and so much. And
Totally.
it's so interesting that that happened on your sixth book and not your first book, right? That
Right.
that means you got that many Girls probably from the five before
Right.
that just felt natural to keep pursuing.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what that did, how that kind of turned you. And when you say your why was becoming smaller and smaller, like what are some tangible steps that we can take to help our
Mm,
why expand when we
mm,
realize that right now it's actually for the wrong purpose? It's for external validation. Like, how did you tap back into
yeah.
yourself?
Fantastic question. And you're right in the throes of this. I mean, you're making huge transitions in your professional life as well. And there
Mhm.
is a certain amount of gumption and courage that goes with decisions like that.
Yeah.
Um, I read this article one time years ago. Conan O'Brien was being interviewed, and he said, I will butcher his quote, but I've thought of it so many times since then. He's kind of wacky. I think he's a Yale grad, really smart stand up comedian, didn't have a lot of, he doesn't fit the mold of absolutely anything. And for years, people were kind of just would look at him with a quizzical face and think, what is this that you're doing? And there's a line in this whole long profile. I think it was the New York Times Magazine, that insert. And he said something like, I realized I needed to keep shining this particular light in the same direction all the time and not be distracted and not be dissuaded, even when people didn't quite get it.
Mm.
And I have thought of that because the tangible piece of reminding yourself what the why is and why you're doing this and holding on to the things that matter, for me, it's the reader. Maybe for some of our listeners, it's the customer or the client or the person we are serving. That's the ultimate. I was getting distracted by the people in the way, right? And the
Yeah.
people who had the megaphone, right? The people who are going to put this into print and put a nice barcode on it. And those people are super important. And I really like to have very good relationships with those people. However, my hope is that someone in their house next to a fire on a cold day will pick up one of my books and not be able to stop reading.
Yeah.
That's the person. That is the driving force. That's the driving impetus. So the tangible task is to remember for whom.
Mm.
For whom?
Mhm.
I was working for the wrong team. I was working for the wrong thing, the wrong blue ribbon. And I got into trouble with it because I got confused about what had begun this beautiful thing in the first place. And that was to tell stories to make people laugh and make people cry, maybe make people think, to make people take these old words like grace and turn them in the light a little bit, try them out for size, take them off the TJ Maxx pillow and look at their original meaning. That's why I do this. So
Yeah.
the shiny badges can be really distracting, and they can take you off course.
I think thank you for that. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. And before we went down that road, I had already prepared to ask you a question based off of something that I saw you had written about yourself on your website. And I know no one
Oh
ever
dear.
knows their website copy. You're like, okay, you mean
No,
someone else
no
wrote that
idea.
about me.
Oh gosh.
But
I'm nervous now.
right. basically you said something to the degree of like when you finally figured out who you were, because you kept trying on these different sizes and different versions of pretend artsy Kim, I think you put it. And
for sure. Lots of black eyeliner.
Yes, yeah. I felt that in my soul. Or in this case, the novelist who's going for the Nobel versus like what you actually, who you are.
Totally.
But you had written that you were able to actually figure out what you were supposed to do and who your why when you stopped like trying to layer on all these false versions too. So it's almost like there's this external internal situation that we have going on of external validation and internal identity of who we are. And did those two things kind of converge at the same time for you, or was the internal identity work also a separate path that you walked?
I think they're twins. It's a story. They're cords of the same braid, right?
Yeah.
And also, let us be clear that no matter what the website copy says, this is still a work in process, people. I just had another book come out in April, and I had to deal with all of this same stuff again in my own heart. I mean, I noticed I'm not a super anxious person by nature. I would feel a weight on my chest when I lay in bed, like physical reactions to, this is months before the actual release. And I realized, I have to pay attention to this all again. I have to excavate because there's some stuff in the cave down there that's telling me this is why this is not going to go well. You did this wrong, that you're not doing enough. This is like, I had just this narrative associated with this whole process instead of approaching it with, I can't believe I get to do this for my job. I can't believe it. What an extraordinary honor that I get to think things, type things, and then reach into the homes and hearts of people. That's ridiculous. That's the best job I can think of. And I was letting all of the other stuff cloud. So please hear me when I say this is not like I did this for a couple minutes and then I figured it out. I think for me, this has been a dance of returning over and over to, okay, now this new thing, this new venture, this new season. And I like you, am a mom. And my family is in a different season all the time with every new project as well. And it looks different every time. There's no plug and play for any of us. So being willing to be courageous enough to pay attention to those things is always the best way to go. It's not the easiest way to go, but it is the best way.
You just had a massive transition in that you typically wrote fiction and you just released your first nonfiction book. And listeners, Kim's newest book that is nonfiction. We don't often talk about faith all the way in depth on this show, even though you and I both share the same faith background, but there's no beating around the bush given the title of this book.
It's going to be hard not to say it.
Star for Jesus and Other Jobs I Quit, which still makes me just cackle because it says everything it needs to right in the title, right? It's like the people pleasing. It is the level of like, if you did grow up in a church background, at least what it was in the 70s, 80s, 90s was like become the perfect little evangelical darling. And so just the title alone hits me and, my religious trauma spots. But the beauty of the book, no, it's great because
it is great. But I'm sorry about the trauma, not about the title.
No. Yeah. It is meant to redeem and it is meant to show us the truth behind the word, like you said on the TJ Maxx pillows, grace, and to redeem the word grace. And so I would love to hear a little bit more, something that we can take, whether we're religious or not, out of it is, what does that grace look like? What did you discover in the pursuit of grace?
Well, the subtitle of the book is really where I hang my hat. It's rediscovering the grace that sets us free. When you write a book, and I know you know this, Lindsey, that there are just so many conversations about the words on the cover. What does that look like? How do you distill 65, 70,000 words into just a couple that people can remember, and it can be a hashtag, and we can it can explain the entire book in a very short amount of time and type. So for me, that's the hook. We ended up on that. I wrestled with these things. I wrestled with the title. The title's very snarky to say Star for Jesus and then parenthetically and Other Jobs I Quit. At the very beginning, people would write and be like, I want to be a star for Jesus. I'd be like, oh, that's not what this book is about. You're barking up the wrong tree. It's not a manual. It's an untangling. But the reason I love the sub is that grace is always paired with freedom. True grace turns the light on in every room. It does not turn the light off. I think that's one of the ways that we've gotten it wrong. I've heard the word grace used as a weapon, as in your husband is abusing you, give him more grace.
Ah,
Or this is a toxic and traumatic situation. You just need to extend more grace.
yeah.
And that's not the meaning of the word. The word means unfettered, undeserved favor, a beautiful gift that does not cooperate with our sense of math. So there's no subtracting, but there's also no adding. So if we've been given this beautiful thing and then we put on all these bells and whistles and say you deserve this if you do this, or you as the survivor or the victim, you don't deserve it, but your abuser does,
Mm.
that is off. That's wrong. In fact, that is a slap in the face of what grace really is. And so typically when I don't understand something or it's really hard for me to hold something, I end up writing about it. So that's what this book is, trying to figure out something that feels unfigureoutable. And I'm a little closer. And also there is still this beautiful mystery that the
Yeah.
most precious gifts are typically not the ones we deserve, typically not the ones we've worked for. I mean, I know we've talked about this in context of marriage and family, the way your husband, I've seen the way Jeremy loves you and you love him. And I don't think there's a tally sheet involved in that kind of love, right? We're not
Mhm.
saying, well, please refer to my Google sheet and then I'll let you know what you get today,
Yeah.
right? Like that'd be a
Right.
horrible way to live. And yet we kind of approach God with that
Mhm.
idea sometimes, to our own peril and to our lack of freedom. So in the context of what we've been talking about, approaching work that matters to us, um, I wish I would have known years ago how much more freedom I had.
Mm.
That there is grace to cushion every single fall. It is not my job to do this perfectly, which is really great because I can't.
Yeah.
It is my job to keep my heart soft and my hands open and to try new things, to try things that make my heart beat a little faster, but to relinquish a little of the all of the outcome rests on me. That's not true. It has never been true. And it's to our own sadness and actually an impoverishing of our experience if we decide, okay, this is all on me, sister. That
Mm.
that never works beautifully, and we end up spent but not free. So
Yeah.
that's what grace looks like to me these days.
Ah, thanks for sharing that. That is, I just want to like hold that and sit with it and be wrapped in a big warm blanket of it. Everything you just
Mm,
said.
mm,
Because yeah, when I think about it in the context of the conversation we're having, related to who made you the boss and related to this podcast, it's the reason this was even created is because of that striving
yeah,
that our society and our culture tells us is very normal and is very much what we should all go for.
totally.
And it involves zero grace
Yeah,
whatsoever for ourselves. And we
that's
do
it.
feel the weight just carry, like we just carry it and we carry
Yeah.
it and we wear it. And it affects the things that matter most. It affects our relationship to ourselves and to our family and our loved ones. And so to just take your definition of that, I'm so glad that you spent time wrestling with this to come up
Mm,
with that definition
mm,
is really, I mean, even as you were saying it, I felt like lighter as I
mm,
was listening to that.
mm,
And I hope it's something that listeners can give themselves permission to lean into. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
mm. Well, I'm still trying to figure it out. And again, it's not, I mean, I've always loved the construct of your podcast because I know you and I know the heart behind this and that your heart also beats for freedom.
Yeah.
Definitely ringing bells that are in front of us and working hard and finding adventure sometimes through really hard work, right? So, I mean, I don't knit. I'm not saying I'm sitting around with like, I've forgotten that I actually really love work that matters. That's not at
Yeah.
all what I'm saying. I think we're built for that. What I'm saying is it changes the air in the room, in my work, in my marriage, with my kids, in my friendships, with my parents and my siblings. Everything shifts in the room when I come with the soft heart and when I have
Mhm.
more curiosity, less self condemnation.
Mhm.
More, where can I learn here? Less, I am the boss here. And actually, I'm in charge here and in charge of the outcome. It's the
Yeah.
outcome piece that I think I've had such white knuckles with that for so many years. I'm starting to know how to
Mhm.
release that a little bit. I'm not in
Yeah.
charge of that part. I work hard, keep my nose down, heart soft, but I'm not in charge of what happens next.
Totally. Totally. And you like, you know, this from when I spent time coaching with you, when it came to the whole having to let go of the outcome. And so, you know, like hold on to hope, faith, grace, in spite of what the outcome is. When I went
Right.
through a medical journey that I had no idea that I would ever be cured of, released of, there was no reason for me to believe that I would. When you're
Right.
faced with that type of diagnosis, you really have to find a way to accept, all right, I mean, this is so far out of my hands.
Right.
So I really get it. I really appreciate it. And you know, it's
Yeah.
interesting. One of the reasons I invited you on this season in particular was to talk about passion, because
Mm.
in my stepping out of the CEO role, a lot of that has been because it's pursuit of passion, of creativity, something that I didn't
Mhm.
allow myself a lot of leeway with when I was in that role, simply because it was business. It was what the
Sure.
business needed of me, and it didn't involve a lot of creativity. And so I thought we would be talking a lot about passion and creativity and right brain and feminine energy and all the things. And I love that you've actually brought
Mm.
a really great perspective. One, because your industry makes you a business person. You kind of have
Mm.
to be to survive.
Right.
But that you're able to balance that and to hold that tension.
Mm.
Um, do you have any comments on that? Things to say about that tension? Have you had to
Mm.
kind of learn to walk that tightrope? What does that look like for you?
I'm definitely still learning that too. And actually, every book release is a different situation. Every
Okay.
podcast season is so. That would be one of my encouragements to your listeners that um, being agile and being willing to switch things up is a superpower in any business,
Mm,
but definitely in mine. And then I did want to. I love what you're saying about that the idea of that you are kind of steeping your toes in a different kind of creative work. I would push back that I think that the work you did as a CEO is actually incredibly creative, different kind of creativity.
yeah.
Um, and I would say that having the really the grace to yourself, giving yourself permission to have different seasons is a mercy. So,
Mm.
you and I hang out with a guy named Bob who is so fantastic, and he often gets people to quit their jobs, usually on a Thursday.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've laughed about that a lot. And I know the undercurrent of that is that lots of times by the time people come to one of our events, they're feeling a little restless. So they've
Mhm.
maybe built something else and they want to try, writing a book or doing something a little bit more in that creative space. And that is so, so beautiful and worthwhile. And sometimes there are seasons that we need to conclude or that we need to live for a while. If you want to quit your job on Thursday, sure, go ahead. But you're only going to hear from me. And Bob would say this too. There are seasons that allow for different kinds of creativity and different kinds of passion and different ways that we express that. And I don't put those on a scale. I really don't. I think there are
Yeah.
some times when we just aren't able, for a host of reasons, to steep the toe into
Yeah.
writing the novel. And what happens is if we give ourselves permission to live the season we're in until we know that's expiring, the work that comes after that is richer every single time. The book you will write now, the book you are writing now, you could not have written 10 years ago. You couldn't have done it. You weren't that person, but also you did not have the life experience you have. You didn't have the coming away from something that grows new things when we step
Yeah.
away. So allowing yourself the freedom to know that is huge. And I wish I would have known that years ago. There are seasons. For me, I used to get up at a horrible hour and write, not because I love early morning, but because that was my season. And once
Yeah.
our children woke up, they were so loud. And now I'm in a different situation and working with a different rhythm and cadence.
Yeah.
And I wish I could say to younger Kim, cut yourself some slack here. Okay.
Mm.
This is what you're doing now is beautiful, holy work. It feels like you're just in your yoga pants because you always are. But there are good things happening here and good things growing that later will harvest in a really beautiful way.
Ah, thank you for that reminder, because I tend to have this bad habit of making things very binary. And when I think about if I'm assigning something to that one role, then it's taking away from the times that I thrive the most in that role. Like you were so right,
yes.
or when I was able to be creative. And that's taking away anyone else's permission to bring your true, whole, authentic self to whatever work you're doing, whether it's traditionally right brain, left brain, quote
That's
unquote,
it.
creative, not creative. I
That's
mean,
it.
it's the pure nature of entrepreneurship, right? Is the
Right.
creativity, and then bringing in another side of the brain in order to grow and scale it. So
Yes.
there's not one right or wrong. There's totally seasons, and that was a really helpful reminder. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to turn this in one last little direction that we can kind of look at everything that is Kim, and it's because some people might be listening to this episode specifically because of the work you do as a writing coach, because they might have seen, oh, I've got something inside of me that's kind of tried to claw its way out. And I am curious just to speak for a second to those people. If you've got this thought, if you have a book inside of you, if you have words inside of you that need to be let out, what would you, as Kim the writing coach hat, say is the one right next up for them?
Oh, well, that's another fantastic conversation we could have for a very long time. And I would get very nerdy and writerly with you. But I would say this is the unsexiest answer I can possibly give, but it's also the truest. You need to put your tusher in the chair. I would make some math for this. So let's say you want to write a manuscript of 65,000 words. You count how many words you want to do how many new words you want to gather every week. And then it's a math problem to get to 65K. And that is not a very fancy way to respond. I could have talked in metaphor, but I don't do that. I'm a firstborn female. I need to know, how am I going to do this thing? So it really absolutely, for me, every single time at some point narrows to, what's the math? When do I want to be done? How can I chunk this up? Now, for some people, that's going to mean every day at the same time you hack away at your 1,000 new words. For other people, they will go away from the people who are loud in their house and just hammer out a ton of words in a weekend. Do that several times. You will know your cadence, your rhythm, what you're able to do. I feel like the most recent statistic I've heard about this is that 85% of Americans feel they have a book in them. That's a lot of people, 85%. Trust me, once you start writing, all these people will come up to you and say, oh yeah, I've got a book. I just haven't had time to write it. At which point you don't drop kick them because you know Jesus, but you want to. As if all this takes is that you have a little extra time and it'll all just come flying out.
Just
but
give
whatever.
them grace, Kim.
Yeah, no, I don't. I told you I'm still working on this. So 85% say they have a book in them. Less than 1% of that 85% actually writes the book. So that says to me that what's the gap between intention and actually completing is tush in the chair.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and that's not a statistic that, it's not talking about publishing or awards or lists or whatever. That's just finishing the book.
Yeah.
So if you want to finish the book, you have to put yourself in the position to do that. You have to block out time on the calendar. You have to pretend this is a medical appointment for someone you love. That might not be you, because I cancel my own appointments. Yeah. So put it down there, make it happen. It will happen. It will happen if you do it, but you're going to have to get a little scrappy.
Oh, I love that answer, especially because I just talked about not making things, one way or the other. And the fact that you as a righty English person just gave me a math assignment.
There you go. There's your
expecting.
Google sheet.
Okay. The last question I always ask my guests is the same question that we start our dinner time conversations with in the Epperly Sulik household, which is, what is one thing that made you smile today?
Oh, well, we are taught that's easy. And it was an embarrassing smile, but I've gotten back into running, and I shouldn't call it running. I should call it shuffling. Again, middle age. But I went on a nice long run this morning down on all these paths around my home. And you and I are talking in the best possible time, which is fall in the Midwest. It is stunning. It's ridiculous, an embarrassment of riches. So the last thing that made me smile, and I don't typically smile when I'm shuffling running, but I did all along the path. I'm sure passersby were concerned. I had a grin looking up into the maple trees, looking over to the aspen tree, looking at the oak tree. They're just so beautiful right now. And I'm saying this out loud to you, Lindsey, because in a month and a half, this same lightness in my voice will have been crushed by the gray skies of winter. So I will pull up this episode and remind myself it used to be really pretty here.
Yeah.
It will come again.
We will hold on to those smiles. And I think, listeners, it's worth going back and watching the YouTube version of this just to see the face that Kim made when she was imitating her running and her smiling. Kim, I know Betsy is going to laugh at that. Betsy is our shared producer.
Bets has seen it. She's seen that in real life.
Okay, Kim Stuart, you are Who Made Me Smile today. This was a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for being on Who Made You the Boss.
What an honor to be here. Thank you.
If you've gained some valuable insights from listening to Who Made You the Boss, there are 2 ways we ask our listeners to show us some love. First, share this episode with a friend who you know would benefit. The more we impact others, the more we can grow our resources to impact you. It's a win-win and it helps us a ton. Second, if you'll take a moment to leave Who Made You the Boss a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast platform, that helps us continue to create meaningful work, and it just makes our day. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this journey. Until next time, keep leading, keep learning, and keep being the boss of your own incredible story.